All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the webinar for information on AB 124, and we're going to go ahead and get started. It seems like some attendees will be rolling in as we go, but that is perfectly fine. So I will go ahead and pass it over to Jessica.
Good morning. Welcome, everybody. In this webinar, we will be sharing information on Assembly Bill 124, which is sponsored by Senator Kamlager. AB 124 supports survivors of violence, including intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking, by allowing the criminal justice system to consider the full context of relevant factors of a person's circumstances and experiences throughout the court process. AB 124 is sponsored by the following organizations: Black Futures Lab, Public Policy Institute, the California Coalition of Women Prisoners, Free to Thrive, Human Rights Watch, the National Center for Youth Law, Survived and Punished, USC School of Law's Post-Conviction Justice Project, the Women's Foundation of California's Solis Policy Institute, and Young Women's Freedom Center. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jessica. So we have a little overview of our agenda here. My name is Laura, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am with the Solis Policy Institute. I'm one of the fellows this year. So we've joined in on the coalition working on AB 124, along with some of the organizations that Jessica just mentioned, and some other folks too. So we are doing this webinar today to just make sure that folks have access to information about the bill. It's a really important bill that we want everyone to feel is accessible and understanding. So we're going to be, someone from our coalition is going to be generous enough today to share their personal account with us. We put a content warning there just to set that expectation that this is someone's personal experience and that there may be content in there that is triggering for folks or that feels heavy, and just feel free to take care of yourself as we go through. Huge thank you to April for sharing her story with us. And we are then going to go through an overview. Two of our coalition members, Jeremy and Paulvi, will be sharing some more details about the bill, just to make sure that everybody understands how the bill works and what exactly it is that we have been working on as a coalition, and what we're really hoping to see shift in the system through this bill. And then we will go over our list of supporters, just so folks know kind of who's behind this bill and where we're at in the process. And then one of our coalition members, Freddie, will lead us through understanding how we can all support the bill and what you can do to join our efforts. And then at the end, we will go ahead and have a space for Q&A. I believe there is a Q&A feature on the webinar. So as we go through, if you have questions, you can feel free to enter those in, and we will be reading those as we go through, and either answer them as we go or likely just save them for that endpoint as well. All right, so again, my name is Laura, and Jaden, who is also a panelist, and myself will be supporting as we go through with any tech needs. You can feel free to message us directly if anything comes up and you need support. All right, so without further ado, I will hand it over to April if you're ready, April.
I think April's maybe having a quick technical issue, but she's about to rejoin.
Okay.
Thanks for introducing us, Laura.
So welcome. Okay, we will just take a moment, and if technical issues continue, we can always swap the order and come back to her, but let's give her a couple minutes to see if it works out.
Yeah, and just to say, April's been so generous with sharing her story throughout the very many hearings that many of you know that this process entails. Yeah, also just in talking to reporters, a lot of folks have a lot of ideas about like about who this bill impacts. And it doesn't always fit the reality. So April will be great to hear from.
Yes. In the meantime, do other panelists want to quickly introduce themselves just so we can give folks a sense of who's in the room, Zoom room?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Pallavi Garg. I am a staff attorney with Free to Thrive. We are a nonprofit legal services organization based out of San Diego and Southern California, and we provide legal services to survivors. It's been our privilege to work on this bill alongside all of these amazing, amazing people, and I will pass it to Jeremy to introduce.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Pallavi. My name is Jeremy Thornton. I am a public defender in San Diego County. As Pallavi said, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to work with everybody here. It's been a real blessing. I'll pass to Freddie.
Hi, I'm Freddie. I use they, them, and I'm with Young Women's Freedom Center. And yeah, supporting with all the comms things and more. I'm grateful to be here. I'll pass to Jasmine.
Hello, everyone. Jasmine Amon, she, her, hers from the National Center for Youth Law, mostly just helping out with tech today, and also super grateful to be part of this coalition. And I will pass it to Jaden.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jaden. Pronouns are he, him. I'm a fellow along with Laura with the Solis Policy Institute, and I'll be supporting in the chat today. And I will pass it to Carrie L.
Hello, everybody. My name is Carrie L, and I'm a fellow at SPI as well, and I'm with Rainbow Services down in LA County. I've been working with this group with AB 124, and I'm excited for all of you to find out more about it today.
All right. So I think what we'll do is go ahead and swap our order just to give April a little bit more time to join, if that works for Jeremy and Pallavi to jump in with some details about the bill, and then we'll come back if she's able to join us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura. So I guess let's talk about, I guess, sentencing and how we really get to the import of what this bill, the major components of this bill and what they do. When someone's convicted of a crime, a felony, a court has really an initial decision to make. Is the court going to place that individual on probation, or is that individual going to be sentenced to prison? In each circumstance, the court is supposed to consider mitigating circumstances or kind of circumstances that would ask the court or kind of justify the court's mercy, right, or compassion. The court will then decide, okay, I'm going to put this person on probation, or I'm going to put him in prison. Assuming the court has decided I'm not going to put this person on probation, the court then has to decide how much prison am I going to give. And the sentencing component of this bill really comes into play in this aspect. Courts, for most crimes, assuming it's not a life sentence, the court has an opportunity to sentence someone to what's called a low term, a middle term, or a high term. As the law stands right now, a court can decide any one of the three based on the circumstances of the case, the circumstances of the client. In 2022, the law is going to change to where, assuming Assembly Bill 124 doesn't pass, the law is going to start in the middle, and then the court is either going to have to go lower based on circumstances or higher based on circumstances. Now, assuming Assembly Bill 124 passes, this bill will require a court, if the individual, and we'll talk about what kind of qualifying individual, what will qualify an individual for this, is if the individual is a qualifying individual and the circumstances of that individual are relevant to the case, relevant to the crime charged and the crime convicted of, the court will have to start on the low term. Now, On top of the prison sentences and the terms, the court has the ability to impose enhancements and run crimes consecutive or concurrent. A crime runs consecutive. When a court imposes something consecutive, it adds time for other charges on top of the initial charge the court has elected. Okay, it's very complicated, but ultimately, when I talk about consecutive, when I talk about enhancements, when I talk about high term, these are all things courts and prosecutors use to justify piling on time and time and time and incarcerating people for as much time as they possibly can, right? And so a court has the ability to impose a prison term consecutive. A judge also has the ability to enhance the sentence based on various factors, right? And so that's how you get an initial sentence maybe of 2 years or 16 months. Then the court looks at how many charges this individual is charged with, and then decides to run it consecutive. So that 2-year sentence now is a 5-year sentence. And then the court looks at the enhancements that were proved in the case. And so that now initial 2-year sentence, which is made 5 because of consecutive sentences, is now going to be a 13-year sentence or a 14-year sentence. And remember, this was one crime that is defined initially as requiring a 2-year sentence, and now this individual is serving in the teens, right? So that's kind of our overview of felony sentencing, and really the time on time that results in people losing decades of their lives for a kind of an insular moment of whatever caused the criminal conduct. They lose decades. And that's what kind of made this bill necessary, is because courts have really neglected to exercise the discretion that they have, and have ignored really their role to I guess, to make sure to bring justice to fruition, and in turn have just penalty, 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 penalty. And so if we can go to the next slide, I can kind of talk about where this bill fits into this and requires judges to really refocus themselves on justice. Assembly Bill 124 does it does a lot. It does a lot for victims. I want to talk about really 3 specific things, and I'm going to leave one to Pallavi's going to go ahead and talk about vacature. So when it comes to the pre-conviction aspect, there are really 3 phases that Assembly Bill 124 talks about and touches on. There's a pre-conviction aspect, a post-conviction but pre-sentencing aspect, and then the post-sentencing aspect, really post-release aspect. Charges are filed against someone, a felon. Several things then happen, right? Plea negotiations take place. The ball is rolling. Charges are pending. The district attorney can make an offer. Then there are defenses that are investigated, kind of at the same time negotiations are happening, right? And then there's a determination of guilt, either by guilty plea or by trial. After trial, assuming someone's guilty, or after a guilty plea, then there's a sentencing. Assembly Bill 124 touches on the negotiations phase and the affirmative defense phase in 2 ways. One, it requires prosecutors to consider the factors that are identified in the bill for purposes of giving a mitigated sentence plea deal. The bill touches on 4 different factors. Those are going to be discussed in a little bit more detail. Briefly, childhood trauma or trauma generally, sexual violence, youth, human trafficking, and intimate partner violence. If my client or the individual who's charged is a victim of any one of those, and that victim relationship is present, then this bill is really implicated, okay? Prosecutors have a duty to consider that. Now, let's say a prosecutor is considering it, but the case is going to be litigated. The affirmative defense allows victims of intimate partner violence or victims of sexual violence to assert where the crime was committed as a result of the victimization, and the crime was as a result of coercion by the abuser, to assert that as a defense, right? It kind of recognizes the abuser relationship when it comes to a victim of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. The abuser's role in causing that victim commit crimes. And what this bill does is say it's not fair that this individual be convicted of those crimes when they're not convicted on their own volition. It allows us to assert that defense at a preliminary hearing, which is an early stage. It allows us to assert that defense at trial. And it allows us to assert that defense, frankly, during plea negotiations and trying to leverage the defense that's been created to have the prosecutor kind of come to their senses and say, look, this is a victim. Like, what are we doing here? Okay, so that's really the affirmative defense aspect. It also touches on the human trafficking defense that currently exists and allows individuals, victims of human trafficking, to not only assert the pre-existing defense for the crimes as they currently are, but it expands it beyond the limitations that are currently in the code and imposes that same expansion for victims of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. Now, let's say someone's convicted, right? Either by plea or by trial. The defense then brings forward to the judge evidence that this individual is in fact a victim of childhood trauma, a victim of sexual violence, a victim of intimate partner violence or human trafficking, or a youth. It says, judge, my client, this individual is a victim or is a child or is a youth or is both. That triggers this obligation for the court to now start, if there's going to be a prison sentence, at the low term, and start at a position where the court is not going to impose any enhancements and impose any crimes consecutive unless it's really required in the interests of justice. It really gives our clients who have been victimized an opportunity to say, I deserve to be treated differently because of my past or because of my age. And it forces judges and it forces the criminal justice system to listen to those pleas for different treatment and then act on them. And I think this bill accomplishes that. And I think Pallavi has more to share about the vacatur aspect or the post-conviction, post-release aspect of the bill.
Thank you, Jeremy. My video is lagging a little bit, so I hope everybody can hear me pretty clearly now. I know Jeremy shared with you guys a lot of the technical aspects of the bill. And as you can see, a lot of thought has been put into every single component. So I just want to take a second to tell you guys why these are the things that are included in the bill. So just from a very high level overview, one of the issues that we know as, all of us who are folks working in some aspect of this space when it comes to working with survivors of human trafficking, of domestic violence, of intimate partner violence, that there are some overlapping issues that come up in all of these types of victimizations. One of those is the fact that oftentimes the abusers have a very psychologically deep hold over the victims as well, which then creates this problem where victims don't identify as victims and survivors themselves. And consequently, law enforcement doesn't identify sometimes and treat them like victims. And instead, they get criminalized. So one of the things that all of us did collectively was look at the research, speak to our experts in this field like April, who have experienced the system and gone through it, and April will share her powerful testimony with you guys in a minute. We looked at where the gaps in the system are. Where is it possible for victims to be identified, where the system is currently failing to identify them? And then from the research, we also know that these issues are disproportionately faced in higher numbers by Black and brown girls in America. So like statistically, we know that Black and brown girls are overly sexualized and overly adultified from younger ages than their white counterparts. And therefore we create this juvenile sexual abuse to prison pipeline. And there's this extensive study that was done by Georgetown Law that's really, really good about showing the statistics for this problem. So we looked at where in this criminal justice space there is room for improvement and better identification and addressing of the victimization of people who go through human trafficking, sexual abuse, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and domestic violence. We also know that sometimes survivors of human trafficking may not identify as survivors of human trafficking, but they have survived and suffered through domestic violence, through sexual violence, and through these other types of victimization. So by expanding the language of existing laws to cover all of these folks, we have created a bill that addresses every single gap, hoping to catch where all of our victims are falling through the system right now. So we are hoping that this will encourage long-term identification of the victims and their rightful protection through constitutional rights of what a victim deserves. So vacatur is one of the most comprehensive things available for survivors right now. However, the current statute under 236.14 only allows for vacatur of human trafficking survivors for nonviolent crimes. Vacatur allows somebody who can prove that their criminal conviction or their criminal arrest was in some way related to their human trafficking experience, then a prosecutor and a judge can review that and assist in clearing that record so survivors' records reflect who they are and not what they've been through. So what we've done is expanded that vacatur relief to include all types of crimes and also include survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence. So if we look at the next slide here, we'll see that there are three main aspects of what we're asking judges to consider. History of trauma, whether it's physical abuse, psychological abuse, childhood trauma and abuse through concepts like ACEs. The age of a person, if they were 25 or younger at the time of the commission of the crime, and their victimization, whether it's human trafficking, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, and how these things connect to the criminal behavior that the prosecutor or the judge are considering in front of them. So our overall hope is that this bill is really going to fill some of these currently existing gaps and provide the why. Right now, the criminal legal system addresses one, whether a crime happened, and two, who committed that crime. This bill seeks to ask the judges to look at why. Why did this happen? And how, as a society, should we be more comprehensively addressing what it means to be justice informed and trauma informed? And with that, I'll pass it back over to the folks for you to hear from April. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula V and Jeremy. I will go back. And April, if you are ready, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
Good afternoon. Hi, my name is April Grayson. I am the Policy Associate for the Young Women's Freedom Center. And I'm really grateful for this bill, AB 124, and the impact that it will have on people, primarily people such as myself. And so I'm going to give you a very extensive background of myself so you can understand how people get lost in the systems. Well, you won't understand how, because it doesn't make sense how they didn't identify me as a victim, but you can see the gaps in how they could have identified and they did not. So I was born in the system. My mother was murdered while I was 3 within the system. And so while I was in the system, I suffered horror, sexual, emotional, mental, physical abuse. And it did a lot of it. Like, it wasn't just a few isolated incidences. I want to say for the whole beginning of my childhood, I was having to survive the foster care system. I was adopted when I was about 4.5 to 5. And the family that I was adopted into, perfect family, 2.5 kids, picket fence on the outside, but on the inside, they had a lot of issues and trauma. And I believe that they were hoping that a child would fix their issues. And so I suffered more abuse within that household. And I already came with a lot of emotional and behavioral problems. So they weren't equipped to deal with the baggage or the trauma that I had brought to their house as well. So my mother passes away. She has a heart attack in front of the family. So that's more trauma on top of already what they deal with on a normal basis. And let me see, I was 14 years old when that happened. My mother died a month before my 15th birthday. And 3 months later, my father, who couldn't handle, the fact that he had lost his wife, the fact that he had to take care of his own family, the fact that he had this child who was a young woman, just a rogue almost, he placed me back into the foster care system. And so within about 2 to 3 weeks of that, maybe a month, I was placed into San Juan Capistrano by the Sea in a mental hospital. And it wasn't, I threatened to commit suicide. I think I was really needing attention. Like my mom had just died. My dad had put me back in the system. I'm in foster care, always have had like, these back-to-back traumatic experiences. So I threatened to commit suicide, I believe for attention. They placed me into this hospital and we were having a sit out one day, me and about 15 other kids. And that day, me and another person was arrested for the sit out. And it was the 2 Black kids, the 2 little Black girls. So we go to Orange County Juvenile Hall. I still don't understand why we were arrested because we were in a mental hospital for one. So they should just put us in some protected cell or whatever they do in mental hospitals. They should have taken us all, not just 2. So we go to Orange County Juvenile Hall. She's released to her mother because we hadn't committed a crime. And I sat in Orange County Juvenile Hall for 4 months. And then from those 4 months, I then went on to be transferred back to LA County because I was a LA County person. And I then went to every single juvenile hall in LA County almost daily because they didn't know what to do with me because I was just being housed in juvenile hall because I had no parents. I was released from juvenile hall, placed back into foster care, different foster cares with, it's almost like a revolving shuffling. It's just a revolving door. While in that place, my brother, my only sibling, dies in a car crash when I was 17. And then from there, I emancipated 18. But technically, it's just a term for aging out of foster care, out of funding, because I wasn't ready to be on my own. I don't think any child is ready to be on their own at 18, especially children who have been through back-to-back trauma and abuse and neglect. Yes, identify. I've been neglected as well by these systems. And then within 2 to 3 months, I am now in Sacramento County Jail, and I am facing pimping and pandering charges with kidnap. Got about 9 felonies stacked against me. But I'm also arrested with a 27-year-old co-defendant who is a male, who also was, he was right there alongside of me. And actually I'm acting out his will and his acts. But this man was never identified as my trafficker. He was never charged with any pimping, any panderings, any charge associated with our crime. He had his own set of stuff that he went to jail for, but it was nothing associated with our crime. I was painted as a mastermind. I was painted as a heinous person that needed to be locked away. And I was sentenced to 20 years, 8 months in Sacramento County. I went to prison and I did 17 years in prison. And during that time, I was able to identify as being a victim of my mother's murder, but it wasn't until like maybe 3 years prior almost to me coming home. Like I had already did about 13 or 14 years before I even identified as a victim to a murder. And I come home, I never identified in prison as a victim of trafficking. I always identified as a perpetrator of a crime. So I come home and I meet a wonderful woman, Terry Galvan. She's the executive director of Community Against Sexual Harm in Sacramento. And I went in to go be a volunteer, to give back. And that day, she made me a client because nobody had ever addressed my trafficking. I've never been identified as a trafficked individual. And she was the first person that saw me as a person and not a crime, and saw that I had been trafficked and that the system had not only failed to identify me, but had also did a disservice to me by not identifying me, because I never was able to heal or get any help from that during my incarceration. So since then, I have gone on to complete their program so that I could, identify and heal and understand that the things that had happened weren't my fault. Like, the system had failed me on so many levels, from foster care to juvenile justice, and even to the adult system. Like, there's nothing in place. It's called the California Department of Correction, Rehabilitation, but there's nothing in place to actually rehabilitate people. All the work that went into me becoming who I am, I did it myself. CDCR never identified anything in me other than I was a criminal. They never saw the other parts of me that led me to go be in a situation with a 27-year-old male who was a pimp, or led me to go be in a situation where I was on the streets trying to survive and trying to live the best life that I knew how to live, with no resources, with no support, with nothing. I had nothing, just myself and my sheer will to live and to try to adapt and survive in the streets. Had AB 124 been a law, somebody would have identified me somewhere. Somebody would have saw that I was born in the foster care system, that my mother had been murdered, that I was placed back in the foster care system, that I had lost every single adult that was supposed to take care of me or was even put in place to take care of me, that I was shuffled through all different foster care homes, and that nobody had ever, like, I'd never sat down and been asked, like, are you okay? Like, you just lost your mom. Are you okay? No, I was arrested. AB 124 is needed because oftentimes young Black and brown women are missed. We're over-sexualized, we're over-adultified, and we don't get to be children. Like, I don't get to be a child. I didn't get to be a child acting out in the mental hospital. I didn't get to be that child. I had to be a person that needed to be arrested because I was violent or I was a threat. And nobody ever said, well, maybe she's just grieving. She just lost her mom, her dad kicked her out. Like, she's been through every system known to man. Maybe she's just sad. And I believe AB 124 will give justice to survivors so that we don't have to go sit in prisons for 17 and 20 and 30 years and lose. I didn't get a chance to grow. I had to grow up in prison. I didn't get a chance to experience normal things that normal young people would have experienced. And then there's more people just like me. There are women sitting in prisons right now, and men sitting in prisons right now, who these systems and these governments just labeled them as these heinous people, but never looked at the fact that they might have been hungry. They might have been repeatedly raped their whole entire life, and they don't know any other way but maybe an act of violence, because nobody has ever saw them for who they are and tried to talk them through that or counsel them through that or get them any type of help or assistance. The system that we have is really rooted in racism, and so we don't stand a chance. I'm better off guilty as a young Black woman than, oh, I'm not saying that right, but I just don't stand a chance. I don't stand a chance. Nobody gives us chances. And AB 124 is on the right side of justice. We're not asking for anybody to save us. We're asking people to see us for people and to give us justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, April. I'm getting some love in the chat as well. I'm going to share screen again.
Hey, Laura, is this me?
Actually, I think this is me, Freddie. Sorry, I wasn't sure if it was already. So thank you so much, April, for sharing your story. And I hope that those on this call can go ahead and get a more clear understanding of why this AB 124 is so necessary in order to give the courts clear guidance and of the protections that are needed for survivors. And so I'm here to go ahead and share a little bit about the supporters that we have gathered throughout the AB 124 process. And so that includes throughout the state, we've been able to gather support by over 90 organizations. These include anti-violence organizations, victim rights groups, organizations that are led by previously incarcerated individuals, there's direct service providers, faith-based organizations, attorneys, and the California Legislative Women Caucus. We have identified service providers across the state that offer trauma-informed and healing-centered services and program for survivors as an alternative to incarceration, which is incredibly important. Thank you, and I pass it on to you, Freddie.
Cool. Yeah, thanks everyone. And thanks again, especially April, for sharing your story. It feels like definitely the most important thing that everyone here can hear today. Yeah, and I also just want to say before I jump in to say how you all can help, just to say, like, we don't think this is a radical bill, like a drastic thing. We think this is something that should have happened many yesterdays ago, because it isn't an anomaly that April's story was like basically like criminalized and penalized from the beginning of her trauma through her time in foster care and mental health care facilities as a youth. Like, that's the norm. That really is the pipeline. So this AB 124 is just one pretty like mild and moderate reform to like help start to reduce that pipeline. But yeah, so as you can see here now, we've made it through several stages of the policy process. We could really use your help if you want to take a screenshot here to call the Senate Appropriations Chair. And I know phone calls are scary, but you probably have had the experience of like, you either get the voicemail, you just tell them to support it, or you get the staffer who's like, great, and they're not going to grill you on it. So please do it. And yeah, for those of you who are able to write support letters for your organization, we'd also really appreciate that. I'm thinking that after the webinar, we will send the letter of support template. So you can follow that. It should be really easy. I'm also going to drop the social media toolkit in the chat to put on, or can I do that? Maybe, or here I can, yeah. To put on the loving pressure to legislators who need to hear just that folks support it. So yeah, thank you again all for being here.
Thanks, Freddie. All right. Yes, looks like the toolkit is in the chat for folks to check out as well. And we are now at our Q&A portion. So if any of our attendees do have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A designated box, or you're welcome to just put them in the chat as well. I don't see any right now, but give folks a moment to think through. I know, those are resources as well. I know some of this was pretty technical, and then we also had April's very powerful story, so a lot to process and maybe just think through for a moment if you do have any questions, and if so, now would be the time to ask. But thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully folks are inclined to support or at least learn something about what we are trying to do with this bill.
Looks like we have a question in the chat about opposition to the bill from particular groups. And I can pass that to anyone in the coalition who can respond.
I can respond. We do have some opposition right now from the CDAA, which is the California District Attorneys Association, as well as a couple of law enforcement groups. I think there's like a narcotics police union association, and that's about it as far as listed opposition goes.
Thank you, Pallavi.
Several counties have, sorry, this is Jeremy. Several counties have signed on, including San Diego and Los Angeles County, to support the bill. We've also met with the California District Attorneys Association, has addressed a concern that they had. And so no other opposition besides the Sheriff's Association, one narcotics association, as Pallavi said, and the District Attorneys Association has come into, has opposed the bill, despite it being well discussed throughout the state and by stakeholders.
Thank you, Jeremy. There's a question here from Carolina. I think you mentioned during the talk, but I want to confirm these considerations should already be taken into consideration, but they aren't. Correct.
So I did discuss that. That I did mention it to shed more light on that. There courts and district attorneys are supposed to consider factors, and prosecutors are supposed to consider what are called factors in mitigation. Probation departments typically prepare a report which are supposed to list factors in mitigation. There are people like April, and April is an example, serving decades in prison because these factors were not appropriately considered. And that's what this bill is asking the justice system to do, is to seriously consider these factors. So what this bill does is it doesn't just tell the court to consider these factors. It tells the court how it must consider these factors by presuming the least possible prison possible. And then starting there, looking at the circumstances of the case, looking at the circumstances of the client, and only going up and imposing more prison where it's required in the interest of justice. I think appropriately it asks the courts to consider these factors as they should have always been considered. As Freddie said, these are changes. This is something that should have been done many yesterdays ago. I think that is the best way to express it.
Thank you for clarifying that, Jeremy. Doesn't look like we have any more questions right now. Let's see chat.
I think to that point, this bill also encourages individuals to identify themselves as victims so that we can have to feel free to, right? To see that their victimization is part of what this process needs to consider by explicitly saying, if you're a victim, the court needs to consider it. And sorry to interject there.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I don't see any more questions either. If anyone else has anything else to add, any of the panelists want to add anything else, you're welcome to. And yeah, we just really appreciate folks coming. Hopefully you got a sense of why this is so important and such an important step towards justice. Obviously, there's a lot more work to be done, but we think that this is a tangible step. And please support AB 124. We really appreciate y'all coming. Hopefully you can take some of those steps to support. We'd really appreciate it. And resources again. Anyone want to add anything?
Just again, huge thanks to April for really like bringing the heart to what we're doing, because that's the point.
Yep. Yes. Thank you, April. All right, everyone.
Thanks all for coming.